If you've ever lost someone and felt them still lingering in the silence, or if you've ever looked for God in a grocery store or found meaning in the smallest domestic rituals, or if you've ever asked life's biggest questions in the middle of life's smallest moments, like washing dishes or walking a dog or watching your child sleep, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing new and selected poems by Marie Howe. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today I'm reviewing new and selected poems by Marie Howe. I picked up this collection as part of my ongoing journey through the 2025 Pulitzer Prize finalists, so if you're following along, be sure to check out my Pulitzer Prize playlist for more reviews and reflections. Marie Howe is a poet I had not heard of before, but to be honest, I don't know many poets. That is one of the reasons I really enjoy this category of the Pulitzer Prizes. This book is the winner of the 2025 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. This volume brings together selections from her previous collections like The Good Thief, What the Living Do, and The Kingdom of Ordinary Time, along with some newer poems. I'd actually say that the newer poems are in a minority, but I still thought all of them were worth engaging with, especially since I had not read any of them before as far as I know. It is a career-spanning look at a poet who's made a name for herself by writing unflinchingly about grief, faith, childhood, sisterhood, motherhood, and the sacredness of the everyday life. Speaking of the author, Marie Howe is one of the most acclaimed American poets, according to the internet. I did not know this, but over the last several decades, she has had quite a few accomplishments and quite a few successes with poetry. She was born in 1950 in Rochester, New York. She is the eldest daughter in a large Irish Catholic family, and she had an upbringing that deeply informed the spiritual and philosophical undercurrents of her poetry. She served as New York State Poet Laureate from 2012 to 2016 and is currently a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and Poet in Residence at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Howe didn't turn her serious attention to poetry until she was 30. She earned her MFA from Columbia University in 1983, where she studied under Stanley Kunitz. Her debut collection, The Good Thief, was selected by Margaret Atwood for the National Poetry Series in 1987. Since then, she has published several critically acclaimed collections, including What the Living Do, a heartbreaking elegy for her brother who died of AIDS, The Kingdom of Ordinary Time, that came out in 2008, What the Living Do came out in 1997, and Magdalene, which came out in 2017, which was longlisted for the National Book Award. Her newest volume, the one that I'm looking at today, New and Selected Poems, came out in 2024, and as I said, it was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. She is, as I already mentioned, famous for her exploration of grief and love, as you can tell by the titles and the subjects of some of her works that I already mentioned, as well as death and the divine in your everyday mundane life. Her poems are widely praised for their clarity, as well as their emotional power and the way they navigate the mystical through the lens of ordinariness. She has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute, and others. In addition to her writing, she teaches at Columbia, NYU, and Sarah Lawrence College. And that is the author. And I think it's important to give you a reasonable summary because I'm not going to go through each of these poems individually, but that should give you a taste of what exactly you're going to get with this collection. It's really hard to give you a good summary of a collection of poems because the real value in the poems is to go read them. And I'm not going to do that here. I don't have the rights to them. And also frequently, a lot of times poetry is written in such a way that you need to look at it to see what the author intended for its presentation. I know there's obviously a spoken element to it as well, but I also would encourage that you take a look at the poems themselves. I find it interesting that if you check this out through Libby, there's always a note on it that says if you're using any kind of e-reader, then make sure you have formatted it correctly so you can see the poems the way they're intended to. And that was just something that I noticed this last time as I read through the various poem finalists and winners. With that being said, I do want to cover at least the broad ideas that you're going to find within these many different poems and tell you where those poems are coming from and also when she published each of her selections that are mentioned, because I think that says a lot about the time period that we're spanning. We're going back into the 80s, and so there's just a lot here. So let's take a look at Marie Howe's new and selected poems. They gather the most essential poems from across her celebrated career spanning over 3 decades, I believe close to 40 years at this point. and it introduces several new words that extend her exploration of her usual themes of grief, as well as love and faith and family and the sacredness of the ordinary, which I have now said many times. The collection opens with selections from her debut, The Good Thief, which came out in 1987, so just shy of 40 years ago. As I already mentioned, this was chosen by Margaret Atwood for the National Poetry Series. These early poems are marked by mythic and biblical allusions, as well as meditations on the body and soul, and a tone of reverence even amongst violence and doubt. And here we see how introduce her distinct voice. It's clear, it's deeply emotional, it's often spiritual, and is unafraid to ask very difficult questions, especially questions that you know there's no real answer to. From there, the book moves into some poems from What the Living Do, which came out in 1997. Like I said, this was a landmark collection written after the death of her brother John from AIDS. These poems represent a shift in house style. Many consider this stripped down. It's very intimate, and they are devastating in their clarity. The title poem is one of her most anthologized pieces, and it captures the bewildering experience of grief while simultaneously celebrating the fragile persistence of life. We then have selections from The Kingdom of Ordinary Time, which came out in 2008, and it continues Howe's movement towards finding holiness in the mundane. These are poems that transform laundry and parenting and grocery shopping and daydreaming into moments of spiritual inquiry. Drawing from her Catholic upbringing and a growing commitment to Buddhist practices, she wrestles with the tension between the everyday and the eternal. I keep mentioning the mundane, but I should say that that is also frequently in contrast with the expanses of eternity. Her most recent poems from Magdalene came out in 2017. It actually recast the biblical figure of Mary Magdalene in contemporary settings, using her as a lens for reflecting on the complexity of female identity, as well as on shame and sensuality and redemption. I believe it was here that there was a very graphic poem. I think all three of the poetry works that I read all had some pretty graphic poems for one reason or another. However, I think it was in this section, as I recall, that I read probably the most graphic of them all. This effort at reimagining Magdalene, it changes her from a penitent sinner to a woman who's navigating the modern world, who is full of contradictions and power, and meant to give her much more definition than a simple flattened narrative that we get from a single source like you do from the Bible. The new poems that close the collection reflect on even more distilled voice. So there is a sense of spare and scarcity and contemplativeness and wisdom. Some are just a few lines long, others linger over memory and silence, but all maintain the emotional honesty and metaphysical depth that characterize Howe's work. What emerges from this collection is not just a retrospective, but a coherent arc of a life lived deeply through language, whether through the lens of Catholic mysticism or feminist reimaginings or quiet moments of reflection. The author consistently invites us to pause, but also to see and to feel and to remember that every moment, no matter how small, might contain some element of the divine. I really enjoyed this collection. Like I said, I had not read much of Marie Howe's work, despite the fact that she has been in the business for a long time. So this was a perfect introduction, and it quickly became clear why she is so widely respected within the poetry realm. What struck me most was how grounded these poems are. Even when she's tackling huge themes like death and God and grief and forgiveness, she's doing it through the lens of things that people can understand. I say every day or the mundane. I can only say that so many times before it just becomes evident that that is the powerful tool that she uses to get across these really profound sentiments that she's trying to express in a way that anyone can understand it, at least to a certain degree. And I really just think there's something very potent about seeing the sacred in things like dishwashing or parenting or standing in line at the grocery store. She does a phenomenal job at making you stop and think about every ordinary thing you do, how that can have a divine perception and divine repercussions. I was especially moved by the poems about her brother John. There is a clarity and vulnerability in those pieces that does not feel performative. It feels very lived in. I think that the diversity in the style of writing, the fact that in her earlier works you can see a lot of biblical allusions, it also tends to be a little more florid. And then as you see certain, I don't want to say progression, but just development over time, time. And so you have that sense of sparsity, but also you have a much more personalized, in the one that deals with the death of her brother in particular. I really appreciate that you could see differences and distinctions over the years. And I can't say which ones I liked the most, but just seeing that she changed as a person and that it was expressed in her poetry, I thought was a really powerful element of this writing. I do not read a ton of poetry, but I certainly appreciated how accessible her language is. That's not to say that the poems are simple. They're deceptively complex, I would say. You can read them quickly, but they will stay with you as long as you're willing to let them. And in some cases, even if you're not letting them stick with you, just the profundity of them can certainly have an impact on you that you just can't quite let go of. There were certainly moments where I had to pause and reread a line or two just to sit with what it made me feel. There are certainly moments of grace and moments of pain, and sometimes both of them at once. And I'd say that this isn't a flashy or experimental collection. Instead, I'd say it's much more contemplative as well as precise and, of course, deeply human. That is one of the defining features of any good poetry, in my opinion. And for me, that made it incredibly rewarding. These are certainly poems that I could return to frequently, and I just might. So who is this collection for? It is for anyone who appreciates poetry that feels grounded and intimate and emotionally resonant, or if you're drawn to other poets, especially contemporary poets that really focus in on the illumination of the sacred or the everyday, either one, then I think that you will enjoy Marie Howe's work, and it will probably have the ability to speak to you. It's also perfect for readers that are navigating grief or spiritual uncertainty, as Howe's poems offer comfort without easy answers. Those interested in contemporary women's voices in poetry, or readers exploring themes of family or faith or mortality, will find this to be a very rewarding experience, in my opinion. This is also a great starting point if you've never heard of her before, like myself, and since the book draws from all of her earlier collections and includes new material, it functions as both a retrospective and an introduction. So if you enjoy poetry that's clear and thoughtful and emotionally honest, I think that this book is for you. Who is this not for? Well, it is not going to be the best for readers who prefer experimental or highly conceptual poetry, or who are not looking for, we'll say, innovations in rhyme or meter. Howe's style is a little more plain spoken than ornate, and her focus is often inward. So if you're looking for, I don't know, political or avant-garde poetry, which you can find, Bluff, another one of the finalists for this year, certainly had that in it. But you're not going to find that here for the most part. I think I have no idea what exactly her politics are, but that's fine. I think the point of her poetry is to tap into something else, and in many cases to actually step away from large, overly complex social issues. Instead, she is much more focused on individual reactions that she is experiencing, sometimes pertaining to something large and sometimes pertaining to something much more personal. I'd say also readers who aren't comfortable with spiritual or metaphysical themes like God and death and the soul and the afterlife, or if you are comfortable with those but only in a very strict sense, then this may not connect with you, since those concerns are woven deeply throughout the work. And like I said, while her clarity of language is certainly a strength, some may find the tone a bit quiet or meditative if they prefer more energetic or surreal poetic voices. That is new and selected poems by Marie Howe. I think that it is a beautiful contemplative collection that invites readers to slow down and really see the world around them. Whether they're mourning a brother or reimagining Mary Magdalene or simply standing at the sink, I think that Howe writes with a clarity and honesty that is deeply moving. If you're new to her work, this book is the perfect place to start. And if you're already a fan, it's a wonderful gathering of old favorites and new insights. Of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read Marie Howe before, or any of her poetry, or your thoughts on any of the other poems from this year's selection in the Pulitzer Prizes, or just poetry in general. Please let me know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments. And if you are enjoying this video or any of my videos, please feel free to share them. The more people that are aware of this channel, the more videos I can make. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.